Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Intelligence Spotlight series. This time, we have a great person with us, a very famous journalist whose work has been instrumental in holding authorities accountable in areas of migration and asylum. We have May Bulman joining us today. May Bulman is currently the investigations editor at Lighthouse Reports, where she leads in-depth investigative work focused on migration, human rights, and government accountability. Previously, she was the social affairs correspondent at The Independent, where she gained prominence for her reporting on asylum, migration, and social justice issues. Her impactful stories expose systemic injustices within the UK's asylum system, housing conditions, and welfare services, earning her multiple accolades, including 2 Anti-Slavery Day awards for her work on human trafficking. May's work is featured in leading international publications, such as Political Europe, New Lines magazines, and Der Spiegel, covering issues ranging from forced deportations to plight of migrants along the Balkan route. Her commitment to highlighting the challenges faced by marginalized groups has established her as a respected voice in human rights journalism. Welcome, May.
Hi, Qais. What a lovely introduction. Thank you so much. It's good to be here.
It's an honor having you here. I'm always fascinated by people who are talking in this series about their journeys and who are they, because usually we look at their reports, we see what they're doing, but barely people know who they are as a person and how they got there. So I want to know your story. What encouraged you to be an investigative journalist and what led you to be who you are now today?
Okay, wow, what a big question. Since I was a kid, I've loved writing. And then it was kind of when I was at university that I started writing a bit for the student paper. And then I had a year abroad because I was studying English and French. So I went to live in France for a bit and then actually went to Senegal for a couple of months. And that's where I did a bit of, in Senegal, I was doing some reporting and I managed to get it was an unpaid kind of very informal internship thing at a newspaper out there. And it was really great because they let me kind of go out and do some reporting myself, do lots of interviews. And I was like, wow, this is just amazing. I'd love to do this as a job. And then got back to university for my final year in the UK. I was a co-editor of the student newspaper, which I really enjoyed doing. And then at that point knew I wanted to do journalism. So I studied journalism as a master's and was luckily able to get a couple of bursaries that helped to cover that. So it's worth, if people are interested in doing that, there are some bursaries you can apply for, which is great. There aren't that many journalism jobs in the UK at the moment. It's quite competitive. So I spent a few months freelancing. I was doing a lot of shifts at The Independent. So I started doing that while I was studying, actually, at weekends. I would do shifts there. But as a lot of people know with online journalism, it's quite a lot of pressure to produce content all the time. And the expectation is that you need to write quite a lot of articles every day. Well, that was the case for me in my first shift job. Just that pressure to get traffic and therefore it was quantity over quality, I'd say, which was a little bit frustrating. But then when I finished my master's, I started doing a few more shifts at The Independent. And I think the first kind of story that I was really proud of was actually about the Calais jungle. So as a lot of people will know, up until 2016, I think it was, there was a kind of camp in Calais in the north of France where a lot of people who were trying to reach the UK would go before they tried to make the journey to the UK. And I was interested in that already, actually. So I'd followed a few Facebook groups about what was going on there. And there was one that I was part of. And it was just basically an accident that I fell upon it. But there was a Facebook post on that group about the situation there and people. It was kind of a lot of charity people and volunteers who were going there to help people who are in that camp. And they were saying basically there's an issue of sexual exploitation going on there. And it was a complex story, but it was a post with loads of people commenting saying, yes, I'm aware of this. Like the refugees there are in some cases being exploited by people who are coming, posing as volunteers, but actually they are targeting people and sexually exploiting very vulnerable people. And then people on the chat were starting to be like, no, we should remove this. We don't really want this to get out there. But I had seen it already and I basically screenshotted it. I thought this is interesting. And then it did later get deleted. Anyway, so I'm going into a lot of detail about this, but it was just interesting because I think it's quite, when we're talking about open source, it's actually quite a good example of like how social media can lead to quite good stories. But so yeah, anyway, I took this to my editor at The Independent, and interestingly, they didn't really see the story in it at first. So I was like, oh, okay. Like they said, no, get on with this other story. Like this isn't that, it doesn't seem that important. But then luckily there was another editor there who I kind of also went to. And this editor was very much like, no, this could potentially be a very big story. And then looked into it a bit more, spoke to some of the larger organizations that were in the Calais jungle, some kind of international NGOs, and they were actually kind of aware of it, but nothing had come out yet. And it was basically highlighting the fact that this was big camp, but it was a very informal camp. It wasn't a kind of, like a lot of refugee camps around the world are, at least they're like formal refugee camps. So they're regulated, and you make sure people can't just come in and out willy-nilly, like, who's going in and out. Whereas this one, anyone could come from the UK or from wherever to volunteer, and which is a great thing really, but there were like a lot of people using that as a way to get in there and target people. So then we did a piece on it, and it went on the front page of the Independence map. And I think that was the point as well, where I thought, subconsciously, but from then on, I started to develop contacts with charities, organizations supporting refugees, and then some lawyers. And like kind of from there, I did a number of stories on the situation in the Calais jungle, and then more broadly, migration to the UK and migration and asylum in the UK. And I think that really showed me that once you're looking into a topic, you inevitably are able to develop your kind of contact list, of people who know about that topic. And that's how I ended up writing more and more about migration and asylum. And then after a few months, I was offered a job at full-time position at The Independent as social affairs correspondent. So I was quite young when I got that job. Came as quite a surprise to me. And I really was thrown into the deep end because I wasn't that experienced at that point. But it was a good opportunity to learn on the job. And sometimes I think that is the best way. Yeah, so then I was at The Independent for 7 years, working on social affairs issues, still a lot on migration and asylum, but also other topics such as homelessness, welfare benefits in the UK, and modern slavery. But then I ended up, after a while, I felt like I wanted a bit more time, because in a national newsroom, it is really hard to get the time to focus on longer term projects. I learned about Lighthouse Reports. They'd got in touch about working on a story with me at The Independent. So we collaborated on a story. And then basically they suggested I apply for a role there as an investigations editor. And as of September 2022, I started at Lighthouse as an investigations editor, which has been really interesting. At Lighthouse, we're focused on just longer term investigations. So it's nice to be able to really develop on my investigative journalism capabilities. And obviously open source like OSINT really is a big part of what we do at Lighthouse. And actually it's interesting because when I was at The Independent previously, I didn't really know what OSINT was. Even though actually looking back, I did kind of use OSINT techniques sometimes, but not really realizing what it was. But it's been really cool to work with OSINT investigators. I've got really amazing colleagues who work in OSINT, and learn from them, and also learning what they're able to do and how, as an investigations editor, we can tap into that. And for every investigation, I'm always like, how can we use their skills to do this? And also I use some OSINT skills myself. I think any good journalist does, but it's amazing when you learn like what is possible with OSINT and the different tools that exist.
The fact that it tells us you immediately also looking for opportunities, but at the same time, you kept working hard. Actually, that tells a story that some aspiring journalists or people who want to start, they give up very quickly because they see, okay, I'm writing and working, but there is no window of opportunity. But it's your dedication to what you're doing can lead you where you are. That's quite remarkable. OSINT has been very crucial, especially recently, in many places where journalists can no longer access due to restrictions or conflict. And OSINT played a great role in uncovering the truth. And combining journalism with OSINT is a great combo, to be honest. Let's go to your work. So through your work, you've, of course, exposed harsh realities faced by asylum seekers and those who are left behind despite promises by the UK and German governments, especially after the fall of the Afghan government. I read a couple of reports on that, the great betrayal of Britain or people who were left behind, the Afghan commandos and others. What were some of the most challenging aspects of uncovering in verifying these stories? And how do you approach reporting such sensitive issues to ensure both accuracy and the safety of those involved?
So we did a kind of Left Behind series, which, as you say, was looking at Afghans who were left behind after the fall of Kabul. And I think we ended up having about 5 different kind of installments of that series. And it's still in a way ongoing. We're still looking at that same topic. But I think it was a real challenge with each of those stories, actually just to verify certain things. We were always looking at the kind of harms that Afghans who had been left behind were facing. But obviously, Afghanistan is a really tricky place at the moment to report on, just because there aren't many journalists in Afghanistan, and if there are, they are at quite high risk, especially if they're reporting on uncovering how the Taliban has done wrong or how they're targeting people. So obviously that, there's a huge risk there. So we had to do quite a lot of this kind of proving the harms remotely, obviously speaking to people on the ground, but remotely. We weren't able to go to Afghanistan because of the situation. And it's actually, we did, for one of the stories, we did actually try to go there with one of our media partners, but actually the Taliban, you had to like write a letter to the Taliban to request it, and they said no. So it was all done through speaking to families of people who'd been targeted, or even people themselves if they'd been targeted. And then, often they would be arrested by the Taliban and might be tortured in detention, and then they'd eventually be released after the elders intervened. We had to go by testimony, so their own testimony or family members' testimony, and make sure that I think we said we need like at least 3 different independent versions of events. And then also visual evidence in some cases where we were able to get visual evidence of things happening. That was quite rare, but we did, for example, in one instance, get some CCTV footage which was quite clearly the Taliban coming to a house and knocking on the door and then basically grabbing the guy who opened the door and pushing him into a van and beating him beforehand. And so that was something that we were able to verify, actually. So my OSINT colleague, Bashar, he was able to geolocate where that was based on kind of where the sun was and buildings around. And so we verified that it was kind of where they were saying it happened. And then we saw the direction the car went in. And that really helped us to verify what this person had said had happened to him. And also, we'd get photos and videos of injuries that people say they'd sustained that kind of matched up to what they described happening to them. And sometimes, like sadly, kind of dead bodies, just to show that certain people had been killed. So it was a lot of kind of combining testimony with visual evidence. And it was difficult to be 100% sure that certain things happened when there were no reporters on the ground. So it's tricky, but we had a threshold that each case had to pass in order for us to say that it was a verified case of harm. But there was a constant consideration of risk of the people who we were speaking to in Afghanistan, because they are obviously putting themselves at risk. So making sure the communications were very secure, trying to do it over Signal rather than WhatsApp and things like that. So yeah, it was a challenging project, but I think important because there isn't that much reporting on what's happening in Afghanistan at the moment, and also holding Western governments to account for leaving these people who worked with them, whether it be in the military or in big organizations, people who were working directly with, say, the German government or the British government. There are a lot of people like that who were left behind. So we felt it was important to try to highlight what's happening to them now.
It was truly a great work there, because the good thing about these reports is that once they're published, a lot of even local media and the exiled Afghan media are picking up those stories and translating them into the local languages as well. So it also spreads around the activist communities. And then they raise the alarm through protests, through their organizations and other places. And unfortunately, we do lack a lot of investigative skills among Afghan journalists, especially when it comes to OSINT. There is that gap because first, a lot of them left their homes. They're trying very hard to resettle in their own country. So kind of there is a break in their reporting. And at the same time, those who are still there, they face risks. And the ones who are trying to work, they're struggling to verify some of the news because they can't contact their own ground sources. So they also heavily reliant on open source verification tools. Let's go to the latest report that you were part of it, and it was interesting for me because it was a very big report in a big collaboration with so many other journalists. Could you walk us through the process of writing the Turkey's EU-funded deportation machines report? How long did the investigation take, and how was the coordination managed across multiple journalists and investigators?
Yeah, so we started that investigation, I think it was in April this year, and we published it just mid-October. So yeah, just over a couple of weeks ago. And yeah, it was quite a challenging investigation because there were so many people involved. And it was actually something that doing the left behind stuff on Afghanistan, it had come up a few times because some Afghans were saying that they'd fled to Turkey, but then they'd been deported back to Afghanistan. And we thought that sounds a bit worrying. And then some people had described seeing EU logos in the removal centers in Turkey. So that raised questions about to what extent the EU is actually funding this process. And then actually one journalist, recent journalist we know, had reached out about potentially about the same topic, basically. So we thought, okay, that's good. There's someone who's keen to do it. Then we actually found that basically quite quickly, but we got in touch with a few others, and we heard that like someone else, a journalist in Istanbul, was already looking at this topic. So we reached out to them and they were keen to do it with us. And then it turned out that there were like about 4 or 5 journalists in Istanbul working for different publications, or some freelancers as well, who were already thinking about doing something on this, but were kind of like, it's such a big topic, we can't do it on our own. So then they all came on board, and then we kind of wanted to have Afghan journalists and Syrian journalists because we were focusing on Afghan and Syrian refugees facing deportation. So it was important to have Afghans and Syrians working on this with us. So we got a couple of Afghan and Syrian journalists on board as well. And yeah, I don't know, it just ended up being a really, really big team of about, how many was it? Probably about 15 people, maybe, which was the biggest investigation I've ever coordinated by far. And so actually even just the kind of coordination side of it was quite challenging because there's that many people, it is hard to bring an investigation together when you're working with so many. But then at the same time, it's an amazing thing to have so many people because you've got so many skill sets and so many perspectives, and we were able to kind of tap into different people's skills and so on. But yeah, in terms of the investigation itself, the removal centers in Turkey were really important to look at because we knew that there was some EU funding in them. So we did a big money trails exercise, and we got a money trails, like a journalist who's very good at doing EU money trails involved. And yeah, so we're doing that kind of as part of it, looking at how much funding you got to each removal center and trying to put together a full money trail of where the EU money was going, and also to what extent the EU is monitoring how it's being used and things like that. And then at the same time, a lot of it was about speaking to people. So speaking to Africans and Syrians who had been in these removal centers and some who'd been deported, and looking at kind of the experience they'd had in those centers that are funded by the EU. And there's a lot of abuse, like reports of abuse that were coming out, really quite shocking stuff about how they were being treated in these centers and how they were being deported forcibly, but how the Turkish state was claiming that this was voluntary, particularly for Syrians. There was a lot of reports of them being forced to sign these voluntary return forms. So it looked like it was voluntary, but in fact, so many were saying that this wasn't voluntary. They were, I was being threatened with violence if I didn't sign it, or even I was beaten until I signed it. And then also looking at what was happening to these people once they returned to Syria and Afghanistan, to show the harm, the post-deportation harm, and the impact that this is having on people being sent back to those places. And then the visual evidence was quite a big part of it as well, to show, because that's something that really hadn't been, because Human Rights Watch had done a report on this on kind of the same topic a couple of years before, but there was no visual aspect to that. So we were trying to get visuals of the inside of removal centers and also of deportations taking place. And we managed to get, it was quite challenging to find because people's phones are confiscated whenever they're detained.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously people can't really take photos, but we did manage to get some videos, and we put together this Excel sheet of all the footage and the pictures, mainly footage actually, that we found mainly on social media. And then we're able to geolocate and verify. That formed a big part of it. We looked at like kind of lots of court rulings in Turkey that actually were showing that people had been unlawfully returned to Syria or Afghanistan. We managed to capture like basically photos or videos of EU logos on, for example, the vehicles that are arresting people in the streets. And also on, like, in one case, we got a photo of an EU logo on a deportation bus where people are being transported to Syria on this bus, and it had an EU sign on it. So there was a lot of this proof as well, like visual proof that the EU is implicated in all this. Yeah, I think that kind of sums it up.
Apparently, that program of deportation existed way before as well. Especially, I remember before the fall of the Afghan government, the EU had an agreement with the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan to receive back the deportees. And they would do the same thing in Germany, that people who had negative decisions on their asylum cases, they would help them in the refugee center, in the camps, and they won't be able to transfer, they won't be able to get a home or work. Normally, people would stay maximum 6 months and then they would shift to permanent residence, but they would keep them there. The only way was that they had to sign a voluntary deportation form. Of course, there weren't like physical torture there, very, let's say, legal way, but there was a mental torture, like keeping people in the same refugee camp for as long as they would sign it. Some of them would just flee from those camps and attempted to give asylum in other countries, like France especially, but others had to sign it because there was also a good incentive for them, 1,000 euros if they sign it as their reintegration incentive back home. So that existed, but the Turkey one was quite shocking too, because of course it's outside of the EU jurisdiction.
Yeah.
So they can do whatever they want with
Yeah.
the money that they receive from the EU. So that's quite incredible.
But yeah, you're right. I mean, reintegration, that's been going on for a long time, the voluntary returns. And actually, there's been, even in the UK, there's always a bit of a question of how voluntary are they when people are actually being detained and they've been given no other option. But yeah, in Turkey, it was kind of a particularly shocking example because of the abuse people were experiencing to force them to sign. And also, obviously, this is EU money. And in the EU, that would be completely illegal to treat people like that. But yeah, it's still being done with EU money.
So they had to report to their donors, after all, how many they deported. Let's hear about your primary principle when it comes to journalistic integrity. When you report, what's that primary principle that you hold very close to you?
That's a tough question. Ultimately, my principle and my kind of aim with my journalism is to get to the truth. Sometimes it's really hard to figure out what the truth is. And when there's lots of different sides to what's happening, it's difficult to figure out what exactly is going on and what's really happened. I think distant work is really important because you can hear testimonies are so important. And a lot of my work has been around testimony, but it's also trying to verify claims all the time and work out what is really happening. Because there's so many things in this world where things are not clear and there's arguments on different sides about what the truth is. But I think as a journalist, our job is to provide the facts. And then with those facts, often there can be important outcomes and that our facts can be used to push for real change. So I think it sounds a bit corny and maybe obvious, but it's like getting to the truth with any issue or any situation. I worked a lot throughout my career with people and like speaking to people, often quite vulnerable people. And I think an important thing as well for me has always been to be humane and don't, you're a journalist first and foremost, but you've also got to look out for people and make sure you're not purely going in and speaking to this person to get your story. You need to be sensitive and take your time over it. And actually, that is the best way to be because then you also build up trust with people. And from a pure humanity perspective, we need to treat people with respect. But also as a journalist, that's important to do that because you then have people's trust and they're more likely to tell you things. So I've had it in the past where I've spoken to someone for one investigation or one story, and then they might come back to me because they trusted me that time and they saw that I wrote a story that was respectful and told the truth as it is. So they've come back and told me something else that's led to another story. So yeah, I think it's two things, getting to the truth, but also kind of making sure you're treating people with humanity.
That's such a wise thing to say. So, of course, you had a start in your career and you were a young journalist trying to figure out your way into this world. What piece of advice would you give to people who are like you, trying to find a foot in this realm and trying to do investigative work through journalism? What was your biggest lesson and advice would you give?
It's another good question. I think for me, as a young journalist, the main thing I learned was really you've got to persevere a lot because it's not an easy industry to break into, but it's definitely possible if you want it and if you really believe that it's what you want to do. Because I think for me, it was just about the hard grafting. Because, like I said, for quite a while, I was just shifting and I was having to write stories that I didn't really think were that important, or I was having to churn things out a lot. But like, I didn't give up. I really I want this. And I did, sad to say it, but I did have to put a bit of my own time, like unpaid hours into it. So for that Calais story, for example, like quite a lot of that was done in my own time. Not all of it, but I'm not saying you have to work for free, because you shouldn't have to work for free at all. I think it's just about having that determination and really going for it. And it might take a bit of time to really get to where you want to be, but it is worth it. I think the people who make it are the ones that really wanted to do this job. I would say in that also just be kind of good to people. Like, again, when you're interviewing and stuff, I think the best way is to be a pleasant individual. It's not that hard. And I have had experiences with people while I've been a journalist who are quite difficult to work with and not necessarily treating people with respect. And I think it's such a basic thing, but just make sure you're treating your interviewees and your colleagues with respect, but also just keep pushing, and you will make it. If there's a topic that you're particularly interested in, do just go for it, because it's quite good to have not necessarily a niche, but like something that you become a bit of an expert on, and always learning more about and building up your contacts. And that helps you, I think, in future when you have that area that you know a lot about and have a lot of contacts.
Amazing. That's very rare for people to think about when they're very early in their career, but it's great to hear from you on that. And I'm sure in your investigative work, you've been using tools. And what tool would you recommend for people to master it at least, or to learn about it? Maybe you can recommend one tool, two tool, how many you like, but usually the starting tool that would be interesting for people to learn about.
There are various different tools. Like, I suppose, because there are some kind of OSINT tools that I actually don't use so much, but my colleagues definitely use. And I think it's worth thinking about this even early in your career. A basic one is just using Google Earth to like try and geolocate videos or visuals to work out where certain things happened. I think OSINT is becoming more and more important in the digital age. And if you can become quite good at that early on, I think that's an invaluable skill to have. So using that, and also just being able to spot things on social media, or search for things you're looking for in the best way, like keywords. There's also like being able to do good Google searches. It sounds very basic, but there's a lot of very smart ways to find what you're looking for on Google or in any search engine, just by how you put it into the search bar. And that's just something that's really helpful, because any journalist will have to search for what's on the internet about a certain thing at some point in their career. And just knowing how to do a quick, really thorough Google search is actually incredibly helpful. So I'd say, yeah, they sound like quite obvious things, but they are worth working on and getting good at.
Exactly. Yeah. Google dorking is one of the ways that you can filter through so many unrelated content and find the exact keywords you can find. And I use it honestly every day when I want to search for something. It helps me a lot. May, thank you so much for your time. It was incredible having you on the show, and keep up the good work.
Thanks so much, Qais. Great to be here. Thanks.